June 4th, 1943. The spoon trembled in Wilhelm Hoffmann's hand. Outside, the Texas sun burned white across the horizon, baking the red earth that surrounded Camp Hearne. Inside the mess hall, silence had fallen, the kind of silence that feels like disbelief made physical. Before him sat a tray that should not have existed, beef stew with thick cuts of real meat, carrots so bright they looked painted, white bread that crumbled softly instead of breaking teeth, and beside it, a glass of cold milk that shimmered like something out of memory. Around him, nearly 2,000 men, the last remnants of Rommel's proud Afrika Korps, stared at their plates as if facing hallucinations. Forks froze midair. A few men wept quietly. Others whispered prayers, afraid the dream would vanish if they moved. These were soldiers who had eaten horses to survive Tunisia, who had boiled desert weeds to stretch their rations, men who had watched comrades collapse from hunger, their gums bleeding from scurvy, their skins swollen from starvation. They had been taught that America was starving too, a collapsing land of chaos and decadence, barely able to feed its own. Yet here on enemy soil they were served what could only be described as a banquet. Hoffmann later wrote, "This cannot be real. They show us propaganda food. Tomorrow we will get turnip water like everyone else." But the next morning, the miracle repeated itself. Oatmeal with sugar, eggs, bacon, butter melting over warm toast, orange juice, a taste that no German soldier had known since before the war. The disbelief spread through the camp like a quiet fever. The propaganda that had shaped their world, of American weakness, of racial decay, of a nation too soft to fight, was dissolving with every bite. What they could not yet grasp was that this abundance was not performance. It was reality. A nation that could feed 12 million men under arms and still have enough to nourish its enemies. This was the first taste, literal and psychological, of a truth the Reich had forbidden them to believe. That their empire of superiority was built on lies. And that America's greatest weapon was not a bomb, a tank, or a plane, but the unshakable power of plenty. February 1943, North African desert. The wind carried sand like razors, biting through uniforms that hadn't been washed in weeks. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of Hitler's global theater, was collapsing under a sun that showed no mercy. The sky above was a flat, blinding sheet of white, and beneath it, the tanks that had once rolled like steel beasts now sat frozen, dead, gutted by American and British fire. Sergeant Karl Witte still clung to his rifle when they found him. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His last drink had been from a muddy fuel can that once carried diesel. His comrades were too weak to speak. They only stared at the horizon where the American lines shimmered closer each hour. The desert had stripped them of everything: pride, strength, even the myth of German invincibility. The sons of Rommel, the propaganda posters had called them. But in that final week they were only sons of hunger and dust. When the Americans finally surrounded them, the Germans waited for the killing shot. They had heard stories that the Allies murdered prisoners, that surrender meant humiliation or slow death. But instead of bullets, they were met with something else: a canteen of water, a cigarette, a medic kneeling beside a wounded officer, cutting open his uniform to treat him. It didn't make sense. Hoffmann would later write in his journal, "The enemy behaves like a man, not a monster. They give water to those who tried to kill them." Perhaps the Führer lied even about this. As they marched toward the holding camp, the disbelief deepened. Trucks brought bread, real bread, not the sawdust rations of the Wehrmacht. When night fell, the Americans didn't beat them. They gave them blankets. The prisoners whispered among themselves, half mad from exhaustion. "They are soft," one said. "That is why they will lose." But in truth, the shock had already begun to sink in. The German war machine that had promised a 1,000-year empire had collapsed after only a few years, crushed by a nation that built liberty on production lines instead of chains. The time the transport ships took them across the Atlantic, many still believed they were being sent to die. Few imagined that the real shock would not come from guns or interrogations, but from dinner tables filled with food, books, and music. A new kind of warfare was about to begin. One fought with generosity. April 1943, Atlantic Ocean. The sea was black and endless, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the transport ship's engines. Hundreds of captured German soldiers huddled in silence below deck, the smell of salt, oil, and sweat thick in the air. Every man expected the same fate: Forced labor in coal mines, starvation camps, maybe even execution. They had been told by their officers that Americans were barbarians, that prisoners would be tortured, paraded, humiliated before cameras. When the coast appeared, a green ribbon on the horizon, many stood in stunned silence. America, the enemy's homeland. A place they had only seen in propaganda drawings, cities on fire, streets filled with crime and chaos. Yet what they saw instead as the ship neared New York Harbor was something that froze them in place. Towers of glass and steel still standing tall, cranes lifting cargo, factories smoking with endless energy. No ruins, no fear, a world untouched by war. As they disembarked, guarded by young American soldiers barely older than themselves, they expected jeers, spit, stones. But the dock workers barely looked at them. No hatred, no mob, just routine. It was as if the war existed somewhere far away, and they were merely a small interruption in the machinery of a powerful nation. A corporal whispered to Hoffman, "They don't even notice us." Hoffman replied quietly, "That's what power looks like." They were loaded onto trains, long, clean, and air-cooled, heading south into the heart of a land they had been taught was broken. The journey felt unreal. The farms they passed were endless and rich, with wheat fields that glowed under the sun, cattle grazing as far as the eye could see. Every mile contradicted everything the Reich's propaganda ministry had told them. How could this country, which supposedly suffered under capitalism's decay, look so alive? When they finally arrived at Camp Hearne, Texas, the disbelief deepened. Barbed wire, yes, but inside, barracks stood freshly painted with electricity, showers, even a library. Some men laughed, thinking it must be a trick. The guard spoke politely, issued them uniforms marked PW, prisoner of war, and handed out blankets still smelling of detergent. That night, as they lay on clean mattresses for the first time in months, a strange unease filled the camp. It was not fear, and it was confusion. The enemy was not who they'd been told he was. And for men raised to believe they were the superior race, the realization was quietly devastating. Night settled over Camp Hearne with the heavy warmth of a Texas summer. Floodlights burned through the wire, casting long shadows across the compound. From the mess hall came a sound that none of the prisoners expected. Laughter. Nervous, fragile laughter, the kind that comes when the mind cannot decide whether to cry or to hope. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and roasted meat. Tables stretched in long rows, covered in trays that steamed beneath the glow of hanging bulbs. The Americans had prepared dinner, thick slices of beef, potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, bread, butter, and, impossibly, chocolate pudding. For a moment, the Germans refused to move. Many stood in line, motionless, unable to understand what they were seeing. Corporal Dietrich murmured, "This is theater. They want to break our spirits." But when he took a bite, the silence around him cracked. The taste and salt, warmth, life was too real to deny. A few men began to eat quietly. Others devoured their food like wild animals. Some sat frozen, tears rolling down faces still covered in desert dust. Hoffman wrote that night in his journal, "We had believed ourselves gods of war, but now we eat from the hands of those we called inferior. It is not humiliation, it is confusion. They treat us as men, and that is more dangerous than hatred." Outside, American guards leaned against the doorway, watching. They didn't sneer. Some even smiled faintly, as if understanding the silent war unfolding in those moments. This was not victory by weapons. It was victory by decency. When the men returned to their barracks, full for the first time in years, they lay awake listening to the cicadas hum beyond the fences. A strange thought haunted them. If the enemy could be this human, what did that make them? The first meal had done what no Allied bombing could. It cracked open the walls inside their minds. It was the beginning of an invisible interrogation, one that asked no questions yet demanded every belief to be re-examined. By morning, the guards would hear a new kind of whisper through the camp. Perhaps we were wrong. By midsummer 1943, Camp Hearne no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a paradox. Rows of wooden barracks stood behind barbed wire, yet within those fences life began to bloom again. The German POWs and soldiers stripped of rank, power, and nation started to build something extraordinary, a town within captivity. Every morning at sunrise, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. A bugle call, roll call, then the sounds of men sweeping porches, chopping wood, and talking softly in their native tongue. The Americans allowed structure, perhaps even encouraged it. Discipline, they believed, kept men sane. Within weeks, the Germans had formed committees, cooks, carpenters, teachers, and musicians. They built furniture from scrap wood, carved chess pieces from soap, and painted landscapes of the Rhine from memory. In one corner of the camp, engineers constructed a miniature theater. Curtains made from army blankets, lights fashioned from tin and wire. They performed plays, even comedies one for each other, complete with hand-painted backdrops of forests and castles. In the evenings, the Texas wind carried the sound of violins, harmonicas, and laughter across the barbed wire. Hoffman wrote, "It is strange. We live better as prisoners in America than our families live in Germany. I feel guilty for being alive." There was a small garden near the fence where captured officers grew tomatoes and herbs. American guards often leaned over the wire to trade cigarettes for fresh produce, joking in broken English and German. Despite official rules against fraternization, humanity quietly slipped through the cracks. The U.S. Army psychologists observed it all carefully. They understood something the Nazis never had: feed a man's body and you calm him. Feed his mind and you change him. But beneath the music and laughter, a quiet guilt began to grow. Many prisoners received letters from home. Families starving, cities burning, brothers dying on the Eastern Front. The contrast was unbearable. Every full plate reminded them of a Germany that had promised greatness but delivered ruin. Camp Hearne became more than a camp. It became a mirror. Every day within its fences reflected a question none dared to ask aloud. Who were the real barbarians now? Autumn 1943. The Texas heat began to soften, and with it came the mail, sacks of envelopes stamped Zenseert in black ink, censored by both sides. For the men of Camp Hearne, those letters were lifelines to a Germany they could only imagine now through paper and ink. But the first words they read were not what they expected. Food is scarce. We trade our furniture for bread. Your sister's children are thin. Hans no longer goes to school. There is talk that Hamburg is gone, bombed to ashes. Each sentence struck harder than any shell they had faced in the desert. The men read in silence, the sound of paper trembling in their hands. Some wept openly. Others folded their letters neatly and walked outside, staring through the barbed wire toward the horizon. That night, no one played music. The theater went dark. Even the laughter that had filled the mess hall was gone. They ate, but without speaking. Every mouthful felt like betrayal. Hoffman wrote, "We live like kings in a land we were told was dying. My mother writes that she eats potato peels. I had chocolate pudding yesterday. There are moments I wish the Americans would treat us cruelly. It would make sense again." The guards noticed the change. Work crews grew quiet. Men turned inward, their eyes distant. The camp chaplain began to visit the barracks more often, reading scripture, and sometimes in German, sometimes in English. One afternoon he quoted a line from the book of Romans, "If thine enemy hunger, feed him." No one replied, but many felt the words cut deep. The Americans were doing exactly that, and it was breaking the prisoners more effectively than interrogation ever could. Then came a rumor. Some men whispered that a camp in the north had refused to eat American food, demanding German rations instead, out of pride. Within days they had relented. Pride did not fill the stomach. But the story spread, another reminder of the strange war still being fought, not on battlefields, but inside the human heart. As winter came to Texas, the letters kept arriving, fewer now and filled with loss. Each one drew a sharper line between the world inside the fence and the world they had left behind. The guilt was no longer quiet. It had become a weight that none of them could set down. Winter 1944. The camp had settled into a rhythm of strange peace. Men woke at sunrise, worked, ate, and returned to their bunks as if they were living in a small town instead of a prison. But something new had begun. Something the Germans didn't notice at first. It started with books. Then films. Then questions. The Americans called it re-education, but it wasn't forced. It was subtle, almost invisible. Every week new reading material appeared in the camp library. Goethe, Schiller, yes, but also Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln, Walt Whitman. English-language newspapers arrived too, filled with stories about democracy, freedom, and justice. At first, the men ignored them. Propaganda, they muttered. Lies. But the curiosity came slowly like a crack in ice. Then came movie nights. The projector flickered against the wall of the mess hall, casting shadows across rows of men sitting silently. They expected to see films mocking Germany or glorifying war. Instead, they saw something else. American families at picnics, children playing baseball, women working in factories, and black and white soldiers eating together in uniform. It was messy, imperfect, but undeniably real. The world outside the fence did not look like the caricature the Reich had painted. One evening, a U.S. officer named Captain Miller, a teacher before the war, spoke through a translator. "You fought for your country," he said simply. "So did we. But if you want to understand why this camp exists, understand this. We are not fighting you. We are fighting what made you believe you were gods." That night, a debate erupted inside the barracks. Some called it manipulation. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, the Americans weren't trying to destroy them. They were trying to save them from what they'd become. Hoffman wrote in his journal, "They show us their world without hatred, and it is stronger than ours ever was." The Reich built its power on fear. The Americans build theirs on belief. Over time, the library filled with English dictionaries. Men began translating words they had never truly known. Liberty, equality, dignity. They had fought to erase those words from the world. Now, inside an American camp surrounded by wire, they were learning them again. Spring, 1944. By now, the guards and the prisoners at Camp Hearne had begun to know each other, not as faceless enemies, but as men. At first, both sides kept their distance. The Americans had been warned, never trust a Kraut. The Germans had been told, never let the enemy see your weakness. But fences don't stop time, and time wears down hate. Corporal James Jimmy Walker was 22 from Kansas, a farm boy who had never been farther than St. Louis before the war. He guarded men who had fought in Africa, who'd seen more death than he could imagine, but he also saw them fixing radios, carving wooden toys, writing letters home. One afternoon, he found a POW weeping quietly behind a barrack. Instead of shouting, Walker handed him a cigarette. No words, just smoke shared between enemies. That moment spread like rumor across the camp. Soon the barriers began to shift. Guards brought newspapers, extra rations, even photos of their families. In return, German craftsmen repaired watches, painted portraits, and built furniture for the Americans. A few learned English. A few guards picked up bits of German. Danke, buddy, Kamerad. Words that shouldn't have existed together began to feel natural, but not everyone approved. Some U.S. officers worried that kindness was weakness. Others argued it was strength, a weapon stronger than cruelty. Captain Miller wrote in his report, "We are showing them what a free man looks like. That is the best lesson we can teach." Still, under the warmth, there was tension. The guards knew the atrocities being uncovered in Europe, rumors of camps far darker than Hearne. Some whispered, if they knew what their army did in Poland, could they still smile like this? And for the Germans, the kindness became unbearable at times. Hoffman confessed in his diary, "They treat us better than our officers treated us. I look at the guard and see the man I was told to hate. But he looks at me as if I am still human. That is harder to live with than any punishment." Late one night, a small group of guards and prisoners gathered near the wire. A harmonica began to play Silent Night. One voice joined in German. Another answered in English. Soon, both sides were singing the same melody under the same stars, the song that once echoed across the trenches of another war. In that moment, the barbed wire still stood. But it no longer divided two worlds, only two versions of what it meant to be human. Summer 1944. Not every man in Camp Hearne wanted peace. Beneath the calm order of daily life, a silent war was being waged, German against German. Within every barrack, there were two kinds of prisoners now. Those who had begun to question everything and those who refused to. The hardliners, the überzeugte Nazis, still clung to their faith in the Reich with fanatical precision. They wore their loyalty like armor. Their bunks were lined with hidden swastika armbands, hand-drawn portraits of Hitler and copies of Mein Kampf smuggled between pages of harmless novels. They whispered that Germany would soon turn the tide, that the Führer was preparing a miracle weapon. To them, doubt was treason, and re-education was poison. When the Americans showed films about democracy, they called it spiritual sabotage. When men spoke kindly of the guards, they called them Verräter, traitors. And when anyone dared to say aloud that Germany might lose, they were marked. At night, inside the barracks, whispered threats filled the air. Fists slammed into tables. The Loyalists formed secret committees, Der Schwarze Kreis, the Black Circle. Their mission: preserve faith, punish doubt. Men who questioned Nazi ideals woke to find their letters destroyed, their belongings thrown outside, their lives made unbearable. One prisoner who dared to denounce Hitler was found hanging from a rafter. The note read suicide. Everyone knew better. Hoffman wrote in his journal, "We thought America had freed us from fear, but fear has followed us, even here. The Führer's shadow stretches across the ocean." The American officers began to notice the fractures. They saw the coded gestures, the silent salutes, the sudden disappearances. Captain Miller ordered secret transfers, moving the moderates to separate camps before they were accidentally killed by their own. The guards began calling them the quiet refugees. One sergeant summed it up bitterly. "You can free a man from his cage, but you can't free him from his own mind." Inside the wire, the war had taken a new form, invisible but deadly. While the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, another invasion was happening in Texas, not of armies but of ideas. Some prisoners began to see the truth more clearly than ever. Nazism was not a country or an army. It was a disease, and even here it was still fighting to survive. Late summer, 1944. The war outside was changing. The Allies were pushing into France, and the Reich was bleeding. But inside Camp Hearne, another kind of battle was reaching its breaking point. The barbed wire no longer separated Germans from Americans. It separated Germans from themselves. The men who once sang and built and laughed were now divided by fear. The hardliners patrolled the barracks like priests guarding a dying faith. Every conversation was suspect. Every glance might be reported. The Black Circle controlled everything. Who could write letters, who could perform in the camp theater, who could speak during roll call. Their word was law, but not everyone obeyed. Some prisoners had seen too much kindness, too much truth to keep pretending. They began meeting in secret, in corners of the carpenter's shed behind the laundry under the cover of night. They spoke quietly of what they had learned, that the Reich was collapsing, that Hitler's miracle weapons were myths, that the world they'd been promised was built on lies and graves. Hoffman was one of them. His diary entries became shorter, sharper, more urgent. "We live among ghosts. To speak truth here is to invite death." One night, a group of moderates wrote a letter to the camp commander, pleading to be relocated for their safety. When the guards arrived to investigate, one of the ringleaders, a young corporal named Ernst Weiss, had already been found hanging in his bunk. The note pinned to his shirt read, "He spoke against Germany." The camp fell silent for days. No one mentioned his name again, but everyone knew why he was dead. The Americans understood now. Re-education was working, but it was also killing. They began quietly separating the camps, one for the Loyalists, another for the Reformers. They called it segregation for safety. The Germans called it civil war. That autumn, the re-education officers distributed leaflets with photographs of destroyed German cities: Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin. The images showed rubble where cathedrals once stood, children searching for bread in ruins. Some prisoners tore them up. Others hid them in their pockets like relics of forbidden truth. At night, whispers spread through the barracks. Who are we fighting for now? Who is left to believe in? The fences no longer kept prisoners from escaping America. They kept men from escaping themselves. Autumn 1944. By now, the rhythms of Camp Hearne had become the rhythms of survival. Work, eat, reflect. But beneath the routine, something quiet and irreversible was happening. A transformation that no propaganda, no ideology, and no bullet could stop. Each morning, work trucks rolled out through the camp gates under guard. The prisoners were taken to nearby farms, vast sunlit fields where American farmers waited, hat in hand, offering nods instead of orders. The men harvested cotton, picked fruit, mended fences. For every day's work, they earned a small wage. Not much, but theirs. And that single fact unsettled them more than they could say. In Germany, prisoners of war were slaves. Here they were workers, paid, respected, and fed. When one farmer handed Hoffman a cold drink after a long day in the field, he hesitated before taking it. The farmer said simply, "You worked for it." That sentence stayed with him. You worked for it. It was the first time an enemy had spoken to him as an equal. Not a soldier, not a prisoner, just a man. It was a small thing. But small things have gravity. Back inside the camp, the change spread like an unseen current. Men who had once saluted portraits of Hitler now took pride in building furniture, fixing radios, translating books, even helping the Americans teach basic German to new recruits. The act of honest work, untainted by fear or ideology, began to feel like freedom itself. Captain Miller observed it carefully in his journal. They are beginning to understand the essence of democracy, that dignity is not granted by rank or blood, but earned through labor, respect, and responsibility. The Americans never lectured. They didn't need to. They simply lived what they believed. The prisoners watched their guards argue politics openly without punishment. They saw black and white soldiers eating at the same table, awkwardly, imperfectly, but together. They saw ordinary citizens debate the government without fear. It was chaotic, yes, but it was free. For men raised in a world of rigid obedience, that chaos looked like madness at first. Then slowly it began to look like truth. Hoffman wrote in one of his last wartime entries, "They do not shout. They do not kneel. Yet they obey. I think that is the greatest power I have ever seen." Inside a camp surrounded by wire, the prisoners were learning what their empire had never taught them, that the truest strength of a nation lies not in domination, but in the quiet, everyday dignity of free men. Winter, 1945. Camp Hearne felt colder that year, not because of the Texas wind, but because of the silence. The prisoners were still eating, working, laughing, but the laughter was thinner now, uneasy. Something was unraveling far beyond the barbed wire, and even here the echoes were reaching them. It began with whispers, rumors smuggled in by new POW transfers, men captured from Normandy, from the Ardennes, from collapsing fronts. They arrived gaunt, hollow-eyed, carrying a different kind of fear, not of the enemy, but of the truth. They spoke of cities turned to ash, of endless firebombings, of the Eastern Front consumed by retreat and revenge. They spoke of Hitler hiding in bunkers, of generals executed for failure, of Goebbels calling for total war while his own people starved. The hardliners in the camp dismissed it all as Allied lies, propaganda to break German spirit. But the words kept coming, and soon, even the loyalists began to fall quiet. Then came the first confirmed report from a captured German officer sent through the camp on his way to interrogation. He told them bluntly that Paris had fallen, that the Allies were in Germany itself, that the once invincible Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. No one spoke after he left. Men sat on their bunks staring at the ground, as if a part of them had been amputated. Weeks later, the camp loudspeakers crackled with an announcement from the American commander. Germany's Western Front had collapsed. Frankfurt, Cologne, Hamburg, gone. And then, a final blow. Berlin surrounded. The news spread like a ghost through the camp. Some refused to believe it. Others wept openly for the first time since capture. Hoffman wrote, "It is as if I have woken from a long fever, and my homeland is already dead." A few days later, the camp received newspapers. Black and white photos showed the destruction, cathedrals reduced to bones, streets littered with stone and silence. For many, it was the first time they saw what their loyalty had built, nothing but ruin. Even the most fanatical men felt something shift. The banners they'd drawn, the songs they'd sung, now they looked absurd, almost childish. Reality had stripped the illusion bare. The Americans didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no mockery, only quiet respect, and a strange sorrow for the men who had finally seen the truth too late. One evening, after roll call, a German prisoner approached Captain Miller and asked quietly, "Tell me, when your cities were bombed, did your people still believe in your leaders?" Miller hesitated, then said, "We believed in each other. That was enough. For the first time, Hoffman understood what victory really meant. Not the destruction of an enemy, but the survival of one's own humanity. Spring, 1945. The war was over. But for the men in Camp Hearne, the silence that followed was worse than the gunfire ever had been. On May 8th, the guards gathered the prisoners in the main yard. The Texas sun burned bright overhead. An American officer stepped onto the wooden platform, his voice steady but strangely heavy. He read the words slowly, clearly, in German. Germany has surrendered. Adolf Hitler is dead. For a few seconds, no one moved. The camp seemed frozen, as if even the wind had stopped. Then came a sound unlike anything before, a low, shuddering murmur that swelled into disbelief, gasps, and cries. Some men collapsed to their knees. Others screamed, cursing the Americans, cursing fate, cursing themselves. A few simply stared at the ground, blank, their faces hollow. The officer continued. The Reich was gone. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was finished. That night, Camp Hearne didn't sleep. In the barracks, men argued until dawn. Some called Hitler a martyr. Others whispered that he'd abandoned them all. And in the middle of it sat Hoffman, silent, holding the latest American newspaper. On the front page, black and white photographs of the camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, mountains of corpses, faces of the living, if they could still be called that. Eyes wide, hollow, lost. The prisoners stared at those images for hours. They passed the paper from bunk to bunk, each man slower than the last to let it go. The silence turned to nausea, then to rage, not at the Allies, but at themselves. No one had told them this. No one had wanted to believe this. Hoffman wrote in his diary, "We said we fought for honor, but there is no honor in these pictures. Only shame." The hardliners tore up the newspapers, shouting that it was fake, Lügen, all lies. But even as they screamed, their hands trembled. Because deep down, they knew. In the days that followed, the camp held mass meetings. The Americans played films of the liberated camps, real footage from Europe. The Germans sat in stunned silence as the screen flickered before them. The smell of pine and dust in Texas mixed with the black and white images of death and ashes on screen. Some men vomited, others wept. A few walked out and never spoke again. Captain Miller wrote in his report, "Today they became free men because their illusions finally died." For Hoffman and many others, that night marked the end of their old selves. They would never again salute the flag they once worshipped. They would never again sing the songs that once stirred their hearts. And yet, in that unbearable shame, a strange kind of clarity began to grow, the fragile seed of repentance and the faint hope of becoming human again. Summer 1945. Germany lay in ashes, but in the heart of Texas something extraordinary was beginning, a quiet experiment the world had never seen before. Its purpose was not revenge, it was redemption. The Americans called it re-education, but to the men inside Camp Hearne, it felt like the rebuilding of the soul. It began with books, then with newspapers, lectures, and discussions. The U.S. Army brought in professors, chaplains, and translators, not to humiliate the prisoners, but to teach them. They were given access to banned German literature, writers like Thomas Mann, Goethe, Schiller, voices that the Reich had silenced. The men read them slowly, almost reverently, as if uncovering pieces of a forgotten homeland that had nothing to do with swastikas or war. For the first time, they began to see that Germany's greatness had not been born in hate. It had been stolen by it. In the evenings, small groups gathered in the recreation hall. They watched American films, stories of democracy, freedom, and moral choice. The guards didn't force them to watch. They invited them. Hoffman sat in the back, notebook in hand. One night after watching Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he wrote, "Perhaps their strength is not their weapons, but their willingness to question power itself." Slowly, the camp changed. The propaganda murals that once adorned the barracks were replaced with paintings of rivers, farms, families, symbols of life, not war. A few men started writing their own newspapers inside the camp. Dar, Roof, The Call, filled with essays about rebuilding Germany with truth, democracy, and decency. Captain Miller noticed the difference. Fights were fewer. Conversations were deeper. Even the hardliners seemed tired. Their fanaticism was collapsing under the weight of reality and reason. When questioned later about the program, one American officer said, "We could have crushed their bodies. Instead, we chose to awaken their minds. That's how you defeat an idea. You replace it with a better one." The transformation was slow, imperfect, but undeniable. Men who once saluted Hitler now quoted Voltaire. Men who once burned books now treasured them. And men who once saw the world in black and white began to see color for the first time. For Hoffman, it was a rebirth through humility. "They showed us mercy," he wrote, "and in that mercy, I saw the true victory of their nation." In the end, Camp Hearne had become more than a prison. It was a classroom, a mirror, and perhaps a quiet glimpse of what a better Germany could one day be. Winter, 1946. The gates of Camp Hearne opened for the last time. The men stood in formation, thinner, older, quieter. Their uniforms faded, their faces lined with the years between surrender and survival. An American officer read their names one by one. As each man stepped forward, he was handed a suitcase, a small ration pack, and a letter, written in English and German. It read, "Go home, build peace. The war is over." There were no cheers, only silence, the kind that comes when a man knows he's leaving one kind of captivity for another. The trucks rolled out at dawn. As the camp faded into the Texas horizon, Hoffman turned for one last look. Behind the barbed wire stood the guard towers, empty now, and the small wooden chapel where he'd first learned forgiveness. He whispered, almost to himself, "I will not forget this place." Weeks later, they boarded ships bound for Europe. Across the Atlantic, the sea was dark and endless, but for the first time it didn't feel hostile. It felt like cleansing. On the deck, men who had once cursed America now shared cigarettes with the very guards who had watched them for years. Some laughed, some prayed. One guard said softly, "You'll be the new Germany, gentlemen, don't waste it." When they finally reached home, they stepped into a landscape of ghosts. Cities they had known were now piles of stone and silence. Streets once filled with music were nothing but dust and wind. Families were gone, scattered or dead. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, mixed with hunger and disbelief. Their old uniforms brought no honor now. They hid them, traded them, or burned them. In the ruins of Frankfurt, Hoffman searched for his family and found only the foundation of his childhood home, and a small cracked photograph buried in the rubble. He kept it in his pocket for the rest of his life. But amidst the despair, something else stirred. In taverns, in churches, in classrooms, Germans began to talk, not of revenge, but of rebuilding. And among them were men who had learned a different kind of strength, the ones who had seen America not as an enemy but as a mirror. They brought with them strange habits, reading newspapers critically, debating openly, helping strangers without question. Small things, but together they formed the first fragile shape of a new German spirit. Hoffman joined a local school as a teacher. When a student once asked him, "What did America teach you?" he paused for a long moment and said, "That freedom is not something you are given. It is something you must deserve, every day." In the end, their journey home was not a return to what they had lost. It was the beginning of something that had never existed before. Late 1940s. The war had ended, but the silence never did. For the men who returned from Camp Hearne, life in post-war Germany was a landscape of questions with no easy answers. Hoffman lived in a small flat above a bakery in Wiesbaden. Every morning, he watched the townspeople sweep rubble from the streets that never seemed to get clean. Children played among ruins as if they'd never known anything else. And in the evenings, as he walked home, he would hear the sound of church bells echoing through the empty windows of bombed-out buildings, haunting, hollow, but somehow alive. He had survived. He had food, work, a roof, but inside, he carried a weight that no one could see. Many former POWs from America avoided talking about their captivity. To some, it sounded like betrayal. How could they speak of kindness from the enemy while their own country still mourned its dead? They called it the double silence, unable to speak of the war and unable to forget it. Yet beneath that silence, something profound was happening. Those men began writing, letters, diaries, books. They spoke not of battles but of awakening. They described how they had discovered freedom while behind barbed wire, how they had learned humanity from those they once called inferior. Some of those writings would later become the moral foundation of West Germany's new identity, its cautious democracy, its refusal to worship power again. The very men who once fought for dictatorship now became advocates for truth, accountability, and peace. But the guilt never left them. When Hoffman read about the Nuremberg trials, he couldn't sleep. He saw faces of men who looked like his old comrades, some defiant, some weeping, all broken. He wondered again and again how many of them had believed they were doing the right thing. He wrote, "Our punishment was not captivity, it was memory." In the quiet years that followed, he taught his students not history but conscience. He told them to question authority, to think, to speak, to never again let obedience silence morality. He never mentioned Camp Hearne by name. But when one student asked why he always treated every child with such patience, he smiled faintly and said, "Because someone once treated me with kindness when I least deserved it." That was his confession. And his redemption, as Germany rebuilt, and with new factories, new homes, new pride. A generation of silent men carried inside them the invisible legacy of those Texas camps, the lesson that freedom must be rebuilt not just in cities, but in hearts. By 1946, Camp Hearne was empty. The barracks were quiet now, the bunks stripped bare, the fences rusting in the Texas sun. The wind still carried traces of laughter, songs, and arguments that once filled those walls. But to the American officers who had run the camp, it was more than a memory. It was a lesson, one they hadn't expected to learn. Captain John Miller walked the perimeter one last time before the camp was dismantled. He'd spent nearly 3 years overseeing men who had once sworn to destroy everything he believed in. Yet as he passed the old mess hall, the classrooms, the theater built by the prisoners, he realized something unsettling. He no longer thought of them as enemies. He thought of them as men. When Miller returned home to Ohio, people asked him what it was like to guard Nazis. He never had a simple answer. He'd seen brutality in Europe, yes, in the camps, in the rubble, in the eyes of liberated prisoners. But he'd also seen something else in Texas, transformation. And that, he told them, had changed him. In one of his final reports to Washington, Miller wrote, "We learned that the mind can be rebuilt, but only when dignity is offered before it is deserved." He described how the German prisoners had responded not to force, but to fairness, not to punishment, but to patience. He argued that the greatest weapon America had wielded was not the atomic bomb, but decency. Years later, when interviewed for a veterans oral history project, Miller reflected, "We were told to keep them contained. But I think they contained us too, kept us from becoming what we were fighting." He wasn't alone. Many guards and officers left Camp Hearne with a changed understanding of victory. They had seen what happened when hatred was met not with more hatred, but with humanity. It didn't erase the crimes of the war, but it proved something deeper. That the human spirit, once stripped of ideology, could find its way back to light. Some former guards kept in contact with the Germans they had watched over. Letters crossed the Atlantic, letters filled not with politics but gratitude. One read, "You treated us as men. Because of that I became one again." For the Americans, those words meant more than any medal or ceremony. They had gone to war to destroy tyranny. They came home having learned how to preserve freedom. In their eyes, the victory was no longer just military. It was moral, a reminder that even in the shadow of history's darkest acts, mercy can be the truest form of strength. And long after the fences of Camp Hearne had fallen, the memory of that mercy endured, dies quiet, invisible, but powerful enough to shape the conscience of two nations. Decades passed. The fields of Hearne, Texas grew wild again, grass reclaiming the outlines of barracks, wind whispering through the empty foundations. Most who drove past the quiet site never knew what had happened there. No monuments, no fanfare, just earth, sun, and silence. But for those who had once lived behind that wire, and those who had once stood guard outside it, the camp never really vanished. It remained inside them, a ghost of both pain and grace. In post-war Germany, men who had been prisoners at Camp Hearne became teachers, journalists, and mayors. They helped shape a new nation, one that vowed never to follow blind obedience again. They taught their children to ask questions. They taught them that patriotism without conscience is just another chain. And in America, some of the guards kept small mementos: a photograph, a letter, a wooden carving made by a German hand. They told their families that the greatest victory of the war didn't come from fire or steel, but from compassion. By the 1980s, historians began uncovering the forgotten story of Hearne. They found diaries, both German and American, filled with reflections, sketches, and moments of quiet humanity. One page, written by Hoffman, was found preserved in a museum archive. It read, "Behind the wire, we learned that our enemy was not the American. It was the hatred that had lived inside us. And when they gave us mercy, we became free. Today, only fragments of the camp remain. A water tower, some foundations, and a small museum run by locals who refuse to let the memory fade. Visitors come from both countries, Americans whose fathers guarded the camp and Germans whose fathers lived inside it. They shake hands. Sometimes they cry. And in those quiet, shared moments, the ghosts of the past seem to rest. Because Camp Hearne was never just a prison. It was proof that even after the darkest chapters of humanity, light can still be found in understanding. That even when the world breaks, we can choose to rebuild, not through revenge, but through remembrance. The story of Camp Hearne is not one of victors and defeated. It is the story of men, broken, taught, and redeemed, who discovered that freedom is not born from power, but from mercy. And though history may forget their names, the lesson remains whispering through time, that the truest victory of war is to never need one again.